So yeah, I mean, I think in a way to kind of repeat some of the things that we were just hearing. One of the things that motivated this book was to think about how we might understand drawing as a way of doing research, drawing as something that isn't only a form of generative thinking ahead of a design project, but actually drawing as a mode of understanding the world that might come after something has been built or during the process of urbanization and so on. And so our thinking was our question was basically to wonder how drawing could create unique forms of knowledge and what kinds of things could drawing tell us if we were to take it seriously as a form of research methodology and if we tried to give it sort of articulate some of the things that it can do. And so we'll kind of like unpack this a little bit more, but generally speaking, the way we've been thinking about it is around a series of different components. There's a series of essays that the three of us have been developing together. There's a substantial archive that we've been developing of drawings that we think are original or exemplary or otherwise meaningful to understand around their particular capacities as they relate to knowledge production. And then there's a series of interviews that we've been conducting with various actors in this field, some of whom have participated in the series, Joe being one of them. Elvite's been here shown during an intense interview, I think on like October 15th or something like that. So, so we've been trying to sort of talk through this with different people who have been working in similar ways. So we'll come back to some of this. To begin with, what I thought I would do, and I think then Charlotte will do the same, is we would talk about how we've been thinking about this with our own work. And I was really intrigued by when we were in conversation about this session and this notion of time and the way that drawing might engage questions of temporality, which is, I think, a fascinating and also kind of strange thing to ask a drawing to do, since they are by nature static forms of media, generally speaking, when printed or otherwise inscribed in a kind of durable form of substrate. Drawings exist in a stable way. They're not animated. And so for me, one of the things that I think is really meaningful about that is that there's this multiple capacities that drawings can have, that drawings can be seen and that they also can be read. And I think that idea of oscillating between the visual and the textual is something that we've been trying to explore as one of the kind of particularly unique features of this form of research drawing or analytical drawing. And one of the places that for me has been really illuminating to learn from in that is the work of basically in the world of comics and graphic novels, because they have fundamentally a narrative dimension to the story, but it's not cinematic. And so one particular protagonist here is I'm sure many of you know him, the work of Chris Ware, I think, is really useful in this respect, because he's really aware of the possibilities of the medium and describes the rhythm of reading and the way the rhythm of reading vis-a-vis the panelization of a set of images then creates the kind of pace of the story, which is very different than the cinematic pace, which has a kind of temporal dimension to it in a more inexorable way, like the clock is running. But here we're paced differently. And so this, for example, as an entry point, consider the time it takes to read, to scan from left to lower right, and then you hear the phone ringing only once during this time. So in a way, and then during that time, you see this drop slowly falling to the ground. So I love this drawing because basically what he's drawing in slow motion in a certain sense, but that's an incredibly fascinating thing to try to figure out. And Ware has been he looks to kind of pre-cinematic comics as a way to understand this relationship to time and the complexity of images, the sort of the idea that there could be a kind of overall gestalt of a panel, and yet you could have simultaneous moments within that. I think resonates a lot with some of the analytical drawings we've been looking at. So, for example, the reason he looks to pre-cinematic comics is he laments the kind of overbearance of cinema on the graphic novel, that with the advent of cinema, graphic novels and comics became basically storyboards, mimicking the behavior of cinematic media, which is basically a screen with speech on top of it. But he looks to sort of more pre-cinematic examples like Gasoline Alley. Here, one example, shown from one of Frank King's broadsheets. And what are, I think, amazing about this drawing is that it's a single image, 12 panels, and yet there's 12 moments simultaneously happening within it. So on one hand, it's linear, but it also is simultaneous. And I think this is, again, something that drawing does incredibly uniquely, and something that we can also take advantage of. So these are just more examples of this, these two characters running through this building construction set. And I think, of course, here resonating with the architectural space that we've been looking at. And so I think that this goes to continue exploring the possibility of simultaneous information at different timescales. I think is something that I'll show some examples of how I've tried to do this with my own research into Walmart. But I think these are some of the features of drawing that I think we've been finding as being particularly resonant when we talk about the possibilities of generating other forms of knowledge, because it can create relationships between and across and within a set of temporal conditions. So here, for example, a story about the narrator's brother who is killed in World War II, and what you see from seeing the drawing, there's this shift from the upper left to the lower right as drawings are replaced with text. But then that's also corresponding to a sort of set of circumstances in which his brother is replaced by his correspondence, and so that's all the narrator is left with. But then you can also sort of enter this drawing whenever, at whatever point you feel so inclined to do. So it's not a linear story in a conventional sense. So I've been trying to, for me, this was all very influential, sort of thinking around trying to make sense of something like the large retail organization Walmart in the United States. And I've approached this from a kind of social constructivist point of view, trying to understand the role that technology plays within these different scales. And I wanted to just call out a couple pieces in the context of drawing to see, in the hopes that they might be resonant or useful here. So just very quickly, as this animation plays, Walmart, as many of you know, is a large discount retailer. That's how it started. It has been one of the largest organizations, largest companies by revenue for the last decade at least. $600 billion last year. So that's basically the same as the GDP of Sweden. It's one of the largest employers in the country, and even though Amazon and Tesla and things they've been getting a lot more news coverage because they're maybe more technologically charismatic, they are still much smaller in their footprint than something like Walmart. And so for me, as someone coming from architecture and urban design, I was wondering, how do they do that? Like, how do they possibly grow the way they've been growing? And they build many buildings a week. This seemed preposterous. How did they even do that? What's the organization, and how do we make sense of it, both as an entity, a spatial entity to inhabit, and how do we make sense of that as a network of things infrastructurally beyond the buildings themselves? And so this was a map simply of locations, but the blue dots and the red dots are different types of buildings. The blue dots are the stores and the red dots are the distribution centers. And you start to see different relationships with the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure of the US. And so from a drawing point of view, one of the challenges, and I think given the topic here, I'll talk a little bit less about some of the findings and more about the challenges methodologically of trying to make sense of something like this. There's no sort of like conventional archive of Walmart the way that there are of other corporate entities in the US. So if for example, like IBM, GM, they're very self-conscious about archiving their own work, and Walmart was very casual or even sort of negligent, one might say, of doing it. And so in order to make drawings and to try to document the spatial footprint of Walmart, which is one of the things I was keen to do, it required a sort of composite view, almost a kind of mosaic in a way of triangulation between different forms of sources. So this drawing is a drawing that's a combination of technical drawing, documentation, diagrams from suppliers, aerial photographs, site visits, and all of that comes together to create an image of what I understand to be a distribution building that Walmart uses. And you see that I'm trying to, in order to, instead of showing it as a static building, isolated in isolation, my thinking was to try to convey some sense of this multi-scalar simultaneity, but also a certain lack of hierarchy in the sense that there's the scale of the figure who's inhabiting the space is working in almost not, well, let's say in the shared level, let's say, of the objects flying through that space. And I think this was inspired by some of the research, archival research I was finding from other sources in logistics, in which the spaces and the artifacts are drawn in the same way. And I think for me, this image from an army logistics journal from the 1980s really sort of revealed the story really clearly, where from the logistical point of view, the object and the space are rendered in a very similar kind of way. You just saw this, so I wanted to show you. I wanted to tell you a story about how these buildings get used. And this is Sam Walton, the founder. He said, we never really planned on going to the cities. What we wanted to do was build a ring around them. And I include this example because I think for me this is a story of the small state of Vermont, which is you might know it as the state that Bernie Sanders is from. It's the kind of historically one of the more progressive pockets of the U.S. And they were really adamant about keeping Walmart away. And so what they did was they undertook this whole kind of military language of creating this kind of barrier to the state. This is the state. And so while they were fighting Walmart off through all these various inventive bureaucratic means, the company was they couldn't build buildings inside this orange shape, but what they did was they put buildings right up to the edge, as close as they could, basically. And I think for me, this is a really straightforward example of how mapping this made it really clear, but seeing it as a table or like a list or something that was textual wouldn't have made the spatial implications clear. So seeing it just as like a textual piece of evidence, the pattern wouldn't have emerged. So I mean, I'm a visual person anyway, but I think the sort of pattern that emerged through this mapping, where then if you take this is 20-mile radius, which is a sort of standard real estate radius. In the end, my interpretation of this was that even if Walmart was not able to enter the state legally, what they could do was effectively enter the state by proxy or by adjacency, because they were so close, they would capture the population and they would pull them out across the border to shop. And eventually the state gave in, but this map basically shows all of the state that's not within 20 miles of a Walmart, and you see that more or less they've managed to overcome that boundary, even though here's examples, they're right on the river, for example. So for me, the idea is that by drawing it, you see that the things like political boundaries become overwritten by the kind of operational boundaries of something like the corporation's geospatial territorial view. Here's another example of their own territorial divisions superimposed over the U.S. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte, and then we'll come back to talk about the book a little more.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse, for that. And so, as was explained before, what the idea of the discussion is to show how we come from different corner of somehow entering into this question of drawing as research. So I'm glad to somehow be able to discuss this topic. So this kind of drawing matters, and to show also some of the let's say methodological tricks that I used in my research. And I picked what is somehow maybe a dramatic title that I hope I can live with, but or up to, but which was related to my dissertation, which I defended in 2018. And so it is about somehow locating, also drawing within a certain idea of a strategic practice of design. And so locating my work with a kind of position on how drawing is a skill that we use to conceptualize or draft or communicate projects toward execution, but somehow scholars of space production and its political economy have in fact used drawings and in particular axonometric views as a method to research and uncover a complex phenomenon involved in the production of space that the profession is confronted with. And I think the Walmart example is a perfect case in point. So To me, the use of drawing in research goes, or let's say signals a broadening of the field, as architecture has ceased to represent somehow the simple act of building, but emerged also as a kind of legitimate research method that allows to tackle matters that are beyond the purview of design disciplines. So I want to show very briefly and specifically with this short talk how a drawing saved my research. And I will start with a small reading. So it's a modest metallic structure on a triangular urban island surrounded and almost hidden by shrubbery and trees. A board on the roof reads Gleam Bakery. A small crowd is pressed against the bars that protect the for-sale counters. There are indeed bars all around and even a decorative metal wall representing wheat. Standing in the back entrance, the baker is friendly yet skeptical. His eyelashes are white with flour. Inside, the public bakery is a busy workshop. Bags of wheat flour are stacked on the right-hand corner. On the left, there are kneading machines, a wood container for the dough, a large table for flattening it and forming the bread, and the two-directional ovens for baking. A simple wall separates the stacking shelves from the sale windows. There are 8 men actively working. Outside, people buy at least 10 loaves at a time. Everyone spread their purchase on any available horizontal surface outside the shop, except for the ground, to let it dry before again staking the loaves of bread and leaving. A mobile bakery in a large truck that reads Moving Outlet for Bread Distribution, Alexandria Governorate, pulls up to load warm bread. This is the delivery system for districts at the periphery of the city. As I leave the bakery with traces of flour on my jacket, the baker waves goodbye. So this is an extract from the Alexandria Diaries, which is a sort of log that I kept during my fieldwork in Alexandria, Egypt, which was part of my doctoral research, perhaps hinting at a certain way to appropriate research experience and translate it into something intimate that we will find again later in drawing. So just for the sake of the context, the research is called Food Territories, the Political Economy of Food Systems and its Effects on the Built Environment, case study Egypt, and it's organized in 3 parts. I won't dwell too much on it, but just to say that the particular drawing that I want to talk about is located as the first case studies, food subsidies and urban space at Alexandria, but actually the whole research is interested in, let's say, larger logics of food production, and there is a kind of unifying framework that functions a bit like an hourglass. It's from global to local to global. And so while the first part is very much about food systems and trying to narrow the topic to grain, wheat, and bread, and to understand what are the driving forces, the second part, Egyptian territories, focuses on Egypt and concrete current spatial transformation with these 3 case studies and the one I just mentioned. So, and the third part is the conclusion. And basically, it's also related to how, or it has a Foucauldian angle and a location of the research around the kind of like biopolitical concept. So it's important to also understand that there is this Foucauldian interpretation of space, and I basically argue that food and the control that is exerted over it via its production, access, or supply is a material expression of biopowers that are defined by Foucault as techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of population, marking the era of biopower. And so food policies and food security belong to this ensemble of tactics that target population. And with this, you may start to see why this bakery is so interesting and how somehow the relationship between architecture, urban form, territory, and food could answer to this question of the political economy of food system and its effects on space, which is the topic of the research. So there is on this building, there are a lot of informations that are, for instance, specifically talking about the price, and this gives us information about what is this bakery actually about. And it is located into a very specific system of bread subsidies that have been institutionalized by Nasser in the 50s and represent a kind of a social contract where the state would be authoritarian and would provide jobs and services. But over time, somehow the subsidized bread became a very strong symbol of a social contract. And also some see it as an instrument of wealth redistribution. Since Nasser, governments have kept the political authoritarian side, but reduced the economic end of the deal, explaining also why bread appears in demonstration, which is also one of the reasons why this research was articulated around Egypt and countries that had undergone what is referred to as the Arab Spring, and a kind of also important element to understand the kind of global outreach of the topics. And then also this connection between food markets and food riots, with a quote from Walton and Seddon that say that modern food riots occur in response to a new and ever more integrated global system. So with this, I want to go back to the bakery and Alexandria as the first object of the research and discuss somehow this methodology and investigation and what the architecture and the materiality of the building can reveal, and what hints are there to take. And maybe it's important, and I'm showing this just to kind of give a bit of a context, but the kind of question of embodied experience that Donna Haraway talks about, sort of trying to build up somehow a meaningful work geared toward gathering knowledge from a local vantage point as much as possible, you know, kind of also entrenched in global and post-colonial politics as a white Western scholar, was an important part of this interrogation of how to deal with the kind of fieldwork situation. So on the one hand, it's tempting to romanticize, and at the same time, it was necessary to remain critical and also aware of my privileged vision and situation. So it was a kind of a bit of an overwhelming situation, and that's where drawing the building was also a way to uncover, let's say, things that I did not understand, or try to order my thinking and to make also actual findings. So as I drew, I realized that, for instance, that building had grids around it that had been added afterwards. There were some sort of apparatuses of defense that, because the building was actually submitted to physical pressure due to the people's needs, and that these devices, for instance, were an attempt to avoid harm both to the building and to the people. And also by redrawing the interior, understanding what was inside the building, what it was containing, what emerged, for instance, is that there was no stock. So the flour was delivered, processed, sold immediately, and the building became immediately an empty shell once this operation was completed. And so this method basically allowed me to deploy the building as sort of a red thread to pool. So first an object, I then understand and contextualize it within the local wheat supply, and then the larger context of the world food system as an agent of food processing, because the wheat actually comes from abroad, is delivered on the harbor, in the harbor of Alexandria, and is then let's say, distributed to these bakeries. So the bakery itself is a kind of agent of food processing that's embedded in the territory in a very tangible way, but also located at the central moment of this larger system. So allows somehow to look upstream and downstream. And so the survey also included other bakeries in the city that were redrawn in the same manner than the first, to also understand and, let's say, compile potentially additional information and observation, somehow to also draw this as controlling device, the controlling device that they were. So again, the drawing then also starts to become its own archive, and allows to become more intimate with the building and its function, and to also understand it not as a separate object, but as something that is that has a sort of intelligence in number with all these bakeries formed. And maybe more generally, the idea was to compile this observation on the effects of these bakeries as a physical expression of the food system, on food supply in space. So these bakeries, they were architectural objects that serves as somehow an entry point into the research. So here you have one towards the upstream supply here, the flour mills that process the grain, so going up, basically upstream. They were stored in these massive harbor silos after entering the country via these grain terminals that were actually shipped. So the ships were coming from the Black Sea ports, from where Egypt sources its grain, up to the Ukraine grain plants and the production fields of Ukraine and Russia. So it's kind of an entire geographical and infrastructural space that I had then defined as territories of grain, kind of armature of this political economy of grain, and of course located in a much more larger system. Here I'm going to jump, but I go back to the drawing here to try to kind of again identify, drawing and mapping these kind of material flows into here what I called flows of grain, trying to understand the kind of materialities and the driving forces involved in the grain chain. So I kind of go by agents from let's say more stylistic, or let's say simplified drawing, to let's say from production to consumption, and then the kind of corresponding spaces, so sort of inventory of the spaces that correspond to these grain chain agents and actions. So the infrastructure of the grain chain, from, for instance, the greenhouses for seeding, the areas of production, the farms and the silos, the transportation infrastructures, the harbors, the docks, the warehouses, the grain elevators, the maritime sea routes, as well as the ships, to the processing industry, the mills, and the distribution spaces, such as shops and bakeries that I just showed, toward to then consumption agents, so homes, basically cities, and domestic spaces, as well as the spaces that are generated by more abstract economic activities, such as research centers or factories and stock exchanges that are, let's say, indirectly architectures of grain. So it's a kind of catalog that seeks to establish correlation between these grain flows, global economy, and space production. So to conclude, I look back to this drawing and maybe to also have a note on temporality. In this case, I think this is very much a frozen drawing, so a kind of snapshot in time. It is a representation that captures this space at a given moment. It is also without kind of the actors. It's arresting the continuous flow of use. It somehow allows also for reflection and interpretation, and also becomes an archive, a kind of tangible form that can be revised, also reinterpreted somehow indefinitely. And somehow I hope to show very briefly here that while this bakery is an architectural object, it is located in urban space, and it is embedded into larger supply systems, and in this case even the kind of the world food system. So it's a locally grounded agent, but the drawing give all its importance to the bakery as a materialized political tool, one of the thousands others public bakeries in urban centers. So Henri Lefebvre says that small facts can be linked to larger perspectives, referring to how daily life informs geography, capital, and social and political fields. And I argue that in a similar way, drawing also offers an accessible way to both understand and translate complex systems such as food supply and space, allowing also to link architecture to political economy, in this case, the political economy. And I want to end with this drawing, which is a much more recent work. And in a way, I think that these are very connected with each other, this idea that the drawing allows you to unpack very complex questions beyond the drawing as a kind of perspective tool, but also belongs to a certain idea of an expanded practice of, or an expanded critical spatial practice that kind of seeks to also understand, interferes, and questions the standard frameworks of the discipline. So also to think about drawing as, let's say, tools to expand the discipline. And I think I end here because we want to talk also about the agency of drawing books. So I'm ending the share, and I know that Jessie will take over again briefly. But one of the perhaps way to jump directly into the three maybe a focus point that we wanted to talk about for this project was the question of urgency. And I think there were two aspects to why we thought that drawing was part of, let's say, answering questions of urgency. So of course, you know, there would be the urgency of now that, you know, I think cannot be overstated, somehow the unprecedented polycrisis that we face, which is somehow grounded in past, present, and future accumulative and extractive economies, you know, from large global systems to, you know, commercial networks like the one that Jesse showed us. So this kind of complex systems also play a role in deploying space somehow as a kind of tool, or like a let's say also the backdrop of perpetuating inequalities. And those are let's say, contain so much intricacies because of globalization mechanisms that are increasingly complex, and the idea that producing drawing can be a sort of a form of intellectual, social, and material engagement. So we've also discussed how we think drawing as politics is also something that can be an entry point into why we think drawing is more than just the kind of potential architectural tool, and that it is a practice that helps to make sense of a changing world, and that it is a response to understanding the greater complexity of our built environment, and that somehow visual representation play an important part in allowing us to acknowledge these developments. I think we have the drawing of Huda, maybe the one of the next one. I think, Jesse, you might have. Yes, exactly. So I think it's interesting to us to also use and Jesse mentioned that we have also a part in the book that is an archive. So it's really not about claiming the idea of drawing as practice as something new at all. It's really to kind of see it in continuity with works that have been produced. And here, I think the drawing of the soil map drawing of Frédéric Aïtatoitou et Alexandra Rennes and Axel Grégoire is a really interesting drawing, of course, in dialogue with Bruno Latour, and how he also described that necessity of a paradigmatic shift in the way that we understand the planet and its multi-species inhabitants. Also, and he has talked about a role for inscription practices. You know, I would quote, what to do, first of all, generate alternative descriptions. How could we act politically without having inventoried, surveyed, measured, centimeter by centimeter, being by being, person by person, the stuff that makes up the earth for us? So while I don't fully subscribe to the idea of like an absolute catalog of the earth to understand it better, I think that such drawing, for instance, speak to also a sort of agency. So the drawing is not always, you know, following codes or representational tools, but it becomes a sort of answer to shift paradigms also in science. And there, maybe, Jesse, if you want to go back to the drawing of Huda, we also talk about how there is definitely also forms of like reflection of practice that has been pioneered by Black and feminist thinkers that have paved the way to interrogate systems of power and knowledge production. And of course, you know, this quote, I think, from James Baldwin is really useful to think about the fact that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing that can be changed until it is faced. And I think that the drawing, in a way, so even if that sentence, of course, is talking about oppressive and destructive racist structures, it also speaks to the fact that there is a need to like enter into the production of knowledge, and the drawing is really useful for that. And here I also want to mention the drawing of Huda Tayob that has been a really inspirational, let's say, practice, and we've also interviewed her in a way, a drawing that's maybe miles away from more clinical drawings produced through CAD, for instance. This drawing is incredibly precise and accurate in size, in proportions, and in recording. So it's a way to also give value to something that could be considered flimsy and unstable, also, let's say unworthy of attention, while in fact it is an economically and socially highly relevant and important network of migrant solidarity in these cases, spaces of kinship and support. And also the attention given to, for instance, the kettle and the cups that stand as a representation of cultures and friendship, and kind of speak to the relatability of these networks of solidarity, is also a way to center different spatialities that we maybe don't look at closely. So there is a second aspect to agency that I will maybe briefly speak to, and then leave Jessie to move on to the two other terms. But we also want to talk about the urgency of research and of spatial disciplines. We kind of identify or locate also the work as a critique, perhaps, to the current landscape of research in academia, which is more and more constrained by a kind of narrowing of focus, and also, let's say, see or like prioritize models that are looking at technological solutionism and also the commodification of science and research. So you have publication paywalls, limited access, a sort of stifling or dissemination of knowledge. And in a way, we think that spatial research faces this challenge acutely. And we've been thinking about the drawing and the validation of the drawing as a legitimate form of research, as something that is an essential step to expand what solid research actually means. So I think hinting towards this idea that drawing can transcend traditional textual and positivistic methodologies, but offer a kind of another medium that engage with spatial components and research agency in another way, is also part of what we've been trying to do as we navigate somehow epistemic urgencies. We think that drawing can also serve as a counter argument to a culture which is increasingly dominated by commodified image from platforms like Instagram and Pinterest. So I think I leave the floor to Jessie about maybe drawing and agency further.
Just unmuting. How do I unmute? Where do I unmute?
You're unmuted. You
I am unmuted.
We can hear you.
That's why I can't find it. Thanks, Charlotte. I feel like we should next time we give this lecture, we should end with your session, your section, because that was so clear. I think that, so very briefly, because I think we would love to be able to have a conversation. As Charlotte was saying, that the way we're trying to frame the book is around trying to begin with some of these addressing some of these bigger concerns, and one of them has to do with how we even understand what drawing is. So it functions as a kind of literature review of sorts in the opening part of the written part of the book, and so I think I'll just go through this very quickly, but just to say that we tried to sort of make sense of this vis-a-vis questions of mapping, and so we've been looking to different kinds of other figures, and it's, I'm sure, familiar to the audience and certainly to the SPACETIME MATTERS project. But one sort of passage we thought was useful from Ray Lucas's book Drawing Parallels was here when he writes that inscriptive practices such as drawing can be understood as a form of knowledge production that provides significantly different insights, not easily accessible through textual models of discourse now. So in a way, we're agreeing, but what we're trying to do is to try to understand exactly the ways of that happening. But I think this notion of inscriptive practice becomes useful. And so we've been sort of talking through different ways of thinking about the relationship between drawing and mapping. And we've, I think, arrived at this idea that maybe mapping is a kind of drawing. And so the drawing becomes this inclusive way of thinking through a broad set of, in Lucas's terms, inscriptive practices. One that is a creative, this is corner, a creative act that constructs the space we live in, and that also is revelatory. And so this is again nothing new, but I think that the as we've been trying to sort of dig into the heretofore the kind of current and other existing forms of methodological distinction or description of this, it tends to kind of focus on the cartographic, and so I think this is where we've been trying to think about the more fully spatial, or the also, as Charlotte is saying, the kinds of modes that engage and admit other forms of knowledge that might not be so positivist or binary or modern, but to be able to sort of think about drawing as an inclusive process, as well as one that overlaps with other diagrammatic practices or data visualization practices. And then finally, to conclude, although I think, again, Charlotte, I think, concluded much more effectively, I think we've been trying to think through the title of the phrase repeatedly: how do drawings have agency? What do drawings do? What can they do? And we've been talking through different kinds of ways that drawings do things. I mean, so one example is where drawings actually are not evidence of something, but they're not signifying some other thing. They actually are the thing. The drawing is the thing that has the most evidence. So patent drawings, for example, where the drawing isn't a drawing of an idea, that it's the only place that this thing exists, and the drawing is the only place that that thing is communicated, differentiated, made legal, disputed, or supported. Or drawings like this, which is, you probably are familiar with these, are they're so-called red line maps. Technically, these are called residential security maps. These were, in case you were not aware of these were in the US. These were drawings made in the 1930s that banks made to assess the desirability or the viability of offering housing loans. So these would be maps that insurance adjusters and mortgage brokers would use to assess a property. And so they would talk to, so someone would come to their bank saying, I'm interested in a home loan to improve my property or to buy a property. Again, the US has this sort of emphasis on property ownership as a mode of social improvement. And so what these maps would do is these maps would be put in the hands of brokers or insurance adjusters, and they would say, well, where does your map fall? Where does your house exist? And if it existed in any of the red zones, they were advised to deny loans. And it happens that these red zones tend to be exactly the same neighborhoods that have been historically African-American neighborhoods. And so what these maps did was basically perpetuate a set of exclusionary financial practices, but in a direct way, but indirectly authored. So the person who was the mortgage broker wasn't necessarily setting out to perpetuate systemic racist practices, but the document made that possible. So the map itself was doing this. And so the reason we're including this one is to acknowledge that the agency we're describing of drawings is not, can go in many directions, that we're trying to sort of identify the possibilities of how graphics work and how they work on us. And so we're engaging in some questions of media studies to understand the ways in which media affect us, but also then instrumentally as political tools. And we've been inspired by the work of Michelle Awan and her work with Schneider and Till and their spatial agency, other ways of doing architecture. And they're drawing from sociologists talking about agency and structure. But I think what we appreciate is this idea that what they're pointing out is that there are these missing ideas of agency around materiality of the body, and they say we want to see this, and we want to imagine agency not only as the privilege of humans, or at the very least, not only emanating from human social structures and their relation to individuals. In claiming such a notion of agency embedded with free acts, of feminist practice of mapping could be imagined that facilitates a move from abstracted possibilities caught within the oppositional logic of struggles toward the production of materially real potentialities that are more open and creative. And so we see that, I think, in a way, this is the kind of inverse of the red line map. This is Laura Kurgan. Sorry, this is didn't mean to do that. This is Laura Kurgan's $1 Million Blocks project, in which the financial expenditures of incarceration were mapped and visualized and made available as a piece of lobbying evidence. But then also, I think we see the I think we've also been finding the idea of, as Charlotte was saying, this archival practice as being one that's expansive and future looking, so that the archive maybe is something that we consider broadly, and we also think about it moving forward. So the idea that agency might come from the use of the archive, not from the archive itself. So the way that the information within an archive is arranged and deployed, it becomes a direction. And I think Faye and Feral Atlas that was part of the series last year, but I think these drawings do an amazing job of exploring this space in the sense that they don't conform to obvious conventions, but they also fold in a number of different authors, temporalities, spatiality simultaneously in order to tell a story and also make a case about a need for shifts in practice. And so to conclude, what we're doing, the process now of doing is working through a series of positions, of claims about what drawings can do. And this will be sort of the core of the critical engagement with the book. So I'll just quickly talk through them and then we can conclude. So we are arguing that drawings do all these things, and this is also how drawings have agency, because they drive critical analysis, they facilitate intimacy, they position how we look, they negotiate complexity, they operationalize aesthetics, they bridge scales, they expand audiences, they enable intuitive immediacy, they reveal unseen logic, they produce ecologies, they sustain exploration, and they can generate authority. So with that, I will stop sharing for real this time and then look forward to some conversation. Thank you so much for the chance to be here.